Good morning, everyone, to another morning of Free Thought Blogs Con. We are kicking off this morning with a talk with five very distinguished guests. We are going to be talking about true religions. So we're going to talk about the claim that some religions are the true versions of those religions, or is religion just too subjective to really ever be called true or false? So please welcome all of our guests, and we're going to have Richard Carrier start us off. Dr. Richard Carrier, welcome.
Hello, yeah. Actually, I think before I describe things, I think we should all introduce each other so we know who we are, and then I'll explain what this panel was for and what we're supposed to talk about here. I'm, of course, Dr. Richard Carrier. I'm a historian and philosopher, blog for Free Thought Blogs, written tons of books. So I come at this from the perspective of a historian of Christianity and as a modern philosopher. So semantics is going to become an issue in this talk, I'm sure. So we also have several other panelists, one of whom is Russell Glasser. So why don't you introduce yourself?
I'm Russell Glasser, and I am a non-professional atheist. I only play one on TV sometimes. I host the Atheist Experience some of the time, and in my normal life, I'm a software engineer in Austin, Texas. I don't have any particular credentials to talk about religion, but I have spent a hell of a lot of time in cameras talking directly to religious people and getting a lot of different perspectives on what their religion means to them.
Very good, yeah. And deep in Islamic world, we have Kaveh. Why don't you introduce yourself and your circumstances?
Hello, everyone. I'm inside Iran, a theocracy. I'm Kaveh Mousavi. I blog for Atheists. My blog is called On the Margin of Error. On the subject of religion, my real only credential is that I oppose it very much, and not more than that. So this is me.
Yes. Well, you have perspective being much closer to Islam and the Islamic world than anyone else here. So that will bring valuable experience and knowledge to this discussion. And then next we have Daniel Fincke.
My name's Dan Fincke, and I trained philosopher, PhD at Fordham University, and former Christian, and I blog about atheism and philosophy of religion, mostly in Ethics Guy, though, when it comes to philosophy. And I did my dissertation on Friedrich Nietzsche, one of the great religious critics. And I taught philosophy at universities for 11 years, and now I teach people on Google Hangouts just like this. That's it.
Right on. And also joining us is Alex Gabriel. Alex?
Hello. As Richard says, I'm Alex Gabriel. I write a blog called Godlessness and Theory about, among other things, religion and queer identity. I grew up practicing several different forms of Christianity, and one of the things I've been writing about recently is the idea from friendly and liberal and LGBT believers that the true version of Christianity is the one that says queer people are lovely and God would have been on our side. So that's one of the things I come to this discussion with, but there are others.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, so originally the concept for this was that there is a debate among atheists about whether you can say that something is the true version or the false version. And to give an example, Sam Harris often makes the argument that the brutally violent, sexist version of Islam is the true Islam, and all other Muslims are fake Muslims. They're not following the true teachings of their faith. And then there are people who criticize that view. I think, like, immediately, if you were to apply that logic to Christianity, you could say that there is no such thing as true Christians anymore either. So we might talk about that a little bit. So it gets to me, the whole idea to begin with this debate is whether you can talk about whether there's a true form of a religion or not, and therefore you can say everyone else who's following that religion is following a false form or is not a true version of it. Depends on what we mean by true when we're talking about true religion. So we got to get that semantic question out of the way first. What do you think? What would you say? What would be the meaning of? Would you say something is the true Christianity or true Islam? What does that even mean?
Well, you know, to start with Christianity, allegedly Christians are people who follow the Bible. but the Bible is this big, weird mishmash of documents that were collected over the course of a few hundred years, and eventually a consensus was reached about what the official version of the Bible was. And like you said, a lot of atheists would say that only true Christians are the ones who absolutely follow it to the letter. In other words, the fundamentalists. But even in the world of fundamentalism, I mean, I can't remember the exact number, but I believe I've cited the statistic many times that there are about 33,000 different branches of Christianity, right? And even among the hardcore fundamentalists, there's all sorts of extra-biblical weird stuff that they've come to an agreement about over the years. Like, for instance, the rapture is really popular. There was another Left Behind reboot made pretty recently. Most of that stuff is loosely based on the Book of Revelation, which is incredibly hard to read, and there's a whole bunch of really specific stuff which was only invented within the last 200 years or so. So I don't think that anyone perfectly follows Christianity or the Bible, and I think that the Bible is such a self-contradictory book that it would be impossible to say who has the best version in the first place.
Yeah, I might have more to say about that later, but does anyone else want to weigh in on this? What do we mean by a true version of a religion? Or what do you even think, not necessarily what you mean, but what do other people mean who talk about there being a true version?
Can I jump in here?
Alex, go ahead.
Go on. The first thing that I felt the urge to say was that the idea that Christianity is the Bible definitively and nothing else is a Protestant approach. If you come from Catholic tradition, you have the Bible, and then you have Anselm and Aquinas, and hundreds and hundreds of years of theology.
In my defense, I do live in Texas.
Well, right. Yes, this is true. And perhaps so would I if your nation hadn't left. But no, I don't know. I think I see a lot of talk about fundamentalism in these discussions as being the approach to a religion which confines it to one central text and excludes other things, which, the word fundamentalist was originally a Protestant phenomenon. So I see people like Sam Harris and people in that field applying the word fundamentalist to contemporary far-right Islamism. But in fact, the position in Islam that the Quran is the only thing that counts, which is the actual analog to Protestant fundamentalism, produces very different political positions to what we see in places like Texas. So the idea that the Holy Book is the finite sum of a religion is not universally agreed on by believers.
I've so many things I want to talk about with this, but it's worth pointing out that a lot of things that people claim about what's in the Quran are not actually in there. And so you have that problem too. People assume, well, that's true Islam, but then they can't actually find the passage in the Quran that supposedly supports that as the quote-unquote true Islam. So there are issues with that as well. Kaveh, you were going to comment, I think.
Yes, I want to say that when we are talking about true religion, there doesn't need to be one true religion specifically. Like, there can be a range of possible interpretations. But my argument is that if we want to go back to the text, and not only the text of the scripture, the tradition, the social institutions that religion has built upon through all these years, I think ultimately many readings of these religions are bad interpretations. So a text can have many good interpretations, but it can also have bad interpretations. Like if I say Hamlet is about, a text like Hamlet can be interpreted in a bad way. As a literature student, I see bad interpretation of texts all the time. And when someone says, for example, that in Quran men and women are completely equal, and every verse that you show in Quran that sounds sexist is actually meant as a feminist text. I think that we can easily prove these versions as wrong and say no. Those people who are more to the right of you give a more convincing interpretation. Of course, there is no one single correct one, but I think that would be, you know, an unnecessary expectation for this claim. So, what do the others say?
Yeah, that's interesting because that's the thing I wanted to get at is because I'm the historian of Christianity, so I can come at this from that perspective, and I don't know the history of the Quran, the textual history of the Quran, for example, which would be key to this. Let me give you an example of what I mean. In Christianity, if you were to do this, if you were to say that the true Christianity is the literal reading of the Bible, which, by the way, there's no version of Christianity on earth, even the most fundamentalist, extremist Christianity does not follow the Bible. So already we have no true Christianity by that definition. You know, for example, the Bible, Jesus says not one jot or tittle of the Torah law will be abolished until he returns, because that was in Matthew. Matthew was defending Torah observant Christianity, meaning you had to be a Jew to be a Christian. So you had to circumcise yourself, you had to follow all the kosher food laws and everything. And that was actually the original version of Christianity. It wasn't until Paul came along and said Jesus came to him in a dream and told, or in a vision, and told him that he changed his mind. So already Christianity went off the rails within like 20 years of its creation into something that was not what the original religion was. So there are no fundamentalists today. I mean, you have fundamentalists who cite Leviticus against homosexuality, but ignore all the other stuff in Leviticus about dietary laws and things like that. One of the Keith Lowell-Jensen's a comedian, often points out there's a guy on online who put a photo up of him with a tattoo quoting the passage in Leviticus saying, "You shall not lie with a man as you lie with a woman," and Jensen points out that, you know, just a few verses later it says, "You shall not have tattoos." So here's this fundamentalist Christian who's, you know, very, you know, selectively interpreting the text. So
I also just think it's generally hilarious that guy had to tattoo a reminder on himself.
Yes, that's Jensen has a whole routine on that. Yes.
Yeah. Like, I can't help think of the guy in Memento, who, you know,
right.
You wake up every morning and you're like, wait a minute, what was I supposed to remember? Oh yeah, don't lie with a man.
Yeah, so there's that problem. So the question of determining whether a particular interpretation is even accurate to the Bible. But there's a bigger problem, is that we don't know what the Scriptures said. Because first of all, we know now that there are many forgeries in the New Testament, and there are a lot of liberal Christians who accept that and reject those texts. One of the classic examples is where all of the misogynistic statements from Paul, where he says, do not allow a woman to have authority over a man, do not allow women to speak in public, and all of that. Those Paul did not write. They were forged in his name in a letter that's not his. So liberal Christians, when they reject that, they're historically correct to do so. So that actually makes liberal Christianity truer to original Christianity than fundamentalist Christians who are still following this forged text. And we have other problems where we don't even know the exact transmission of the text, because the text gets corrupted, altered, interpolated over time, and we have no one version that is accurate to the original. We have multiple different versions. We often can't decide between them. And so there is no one true text. It's impossible to even determine what it is. And it has to be true for the Quran. Like, there's no way the Quran was loyally transmitted without people meddling with it over time. But I'm not aware of any particular scholarship looking at ancient manuscripts of the Quran to create critical additions to see how the text deviated over time. I don't even know if that's a thing in Islamic scholarship. And if it's not, that means that the Quran might not at all be what Muhammad originally wrote. And it might not have all been written at one time. So if you can't historically determine that, the door is open to start saying, well, these passages were added later, or I think God would not approve of these passages, so therefore they can't be correct passages, and so on. There's lots of ways you could act like a true Muslim in the sense that you follow the will of Allah, and you just use the inspiration of Allah to decide which parts of the text are authentic and which parts not. I mean, there's no reason to say that that's any less true a version of Islam if you were to do that. Now, I don't know if that happens in Islam. That's the things I don't know Islamic scholarship well enough to comment on that.
Well,
but that's the problem with Christianity.
Right, and there's one person on the panel who can talk to Islamic scholarship, and that's me. I'm just kidding. But what I hear, and Kaveh can confirm or deny, is that they actually destroy old Qurans to prevent this, and there's a total denial of deviations. And seemingly there was a discovery of a whole treasure trove of buried Qurans. I think maybe they can't destroy them, so they have to bury them, something like that. Anyway, but Kaveh might know more about that. What I want to kind of expand the discussion about is there's two ways to expand this. One is that we're coming at this from a very text-centric view because we're influenced by both Islam and Protestantism. And really, religions are not just belief systems that exist, as in glass cases, as this is the belief system, or that it's a text-focused thing necessarily. Religions can be rooted in practices, identity, ethnic allegiances. They can be rooted in sort of continuity of symbol, continuity of community, continuity of a lot of different things than, we've always believed the same things. And there's the Judaism, Christianity in the form of Catholicism, Islam have long traditions of almost jurist traditions of reinterpretation and application in different times and places. And so it's the nature of religion to be a social phenomenon. And so to me, they're more like nations. There is no true America. We could say that slavery is not true to the ideals of America, but it's also a fact of our history, a massive structural fact of our history, and with legacies in our present. When we talk about what America is in truth, or what we're often trying to say is what we ideally want it to be. And I don't mind insofar as religious people are saying, look, this is who we are, and we're evolving this identity. They might want to try and mask what they're doing and say that they are just interpreting the true version or something like that, or they might try and claim they always had it right like this. Like those are obviously lies, and you could argue, well, yeah, your text doesn't say that, and you're claiming you're getting it from the text. But insofar as they want to change their religions, whether or not they want to admit it or not, there's no reason to tell them they're wrong to change a social tradition like that. And the other thing I would want to say about that really quickly is that the other way to look at it, if we do want to take it as a belief system, or if we do want to talk about it as a true version, one thing we might do, besides trying to say, is this authentic to the history, what we might do is say something like what we would say with respect to true science or true morality, right? So what you might do when you're arguing about what true science is, you don't look at what scientists have thought or what their methods have been. You look at what is the most ideal version of the science that accomplishes the science's goals. And if you see it that way, then true science is a question of what approximates to the truth most. And true morality would be what was most morally truthful, what was most practically best. And it doesn't matter what, it could be that for all of history people have said slavery was moral, and up to a certain point it was the majority opinion, and yet it's still immoral. And we're going to change what we say it is. And again, whether or not religions acknowledge that that's what they're doing, when they do that, if we see religion as a practical project in humanity of organizing society and the spiritual life, etc., we can ask the true version might be the kind that accomplishes the true and the good better, irrespective of what the tradition has done in the past, just like nations, just like science, just like morality. It could be something that is open to being improved by normative standards, not just backward-looking ones.
Well, science has a built-in way of benchmarking, basically, because inherent to the process of science is coming up with verifiable and testable ways of demonstrating that that your conclusions are correct. And I think that atheists and theists alike all agree to the extent that there exists a physical world that isn't subjective, that isn't just part of your mind. Arguments about the Matrix notwithstanding, most people recognize that there exists a real world out there. And it seems to me that science's primary concern is coming up with opinions that match the reality that we're able to investigate around us. But the problem with religion is that not only do they not have any way of similarly benchmarking whether they're correct or not, in a lot of cases they actively resist any efforts to pigeonhole them into concepts like proof and verification. I'm sure that we've all had the experience of getting into an argument with a theist, and when the theist gets to a point where he doesn't know what he's saying, instead of just saying, I don't know, he will instead say, well, yeah, but I have faith that what I believe is true anyway, and you can't shake my faith. And this is held up as sort of a standard of virtue, in a way.
Can I say something about what Dan
Yes.
said? I think, first of all, if we look at religion as an ongoing social project, again, we can't really see it as evolving in itself. Much more, I see it as giving in to the pressures of modernity crashing upon it. But apart from that, what I want to say about going back to the text is that, first of all, these are all more than 1,000-year-old. So even at this, I think it's strange for us to claim that they can embody humanistic values, that they can embody liberal values, because these modern values are much younger, at least in the dominant discourse, than than these religions. And at the same time, I think, again, we don't need to be 0 or 100. When we talk about Marxism, there are many versions of Marxism. We have people like Gramsci or people like Althusser who have been very positive in human history, and we have people like Stalin and Lenin. But overall, and like religion, Marxism has not been only a series of texts, but a series of movements. But overall, we can look and say, all right, we can claim that Marxism is against capitalism. And what is going right now in China cannot really be called Marxism. At least this is a contradiction. That is a lack of mental coherence. I think this is a claim that we as atheists can make about religion. And I think it is important because personally, I came to my atheism from this route. I was convinced that Islam was a very liberal religion, but when I read the Quran, I couldn't in no way reconcile my liberal values with the text of the Quran. And when I see perversions of that text to match these values and that text together, I'm not saying this is necessarily a bad thing. I prefer people to be bad logicians and good human beings rather than good logicians and ISIS members. But at the same time, I want to say that no, intellectually you're making a mistake.
Sure. Can I reply to that, or attempt
Yeah,
to?
please.
Well, one point of contrast I would raise is that, for one thing, Marxism doesn't involve in a belief in private communication with God, or the possibility of revelation, or the idea of having a vision that will change what God wants, for example. And also there's the fact that, in simple point of fact, Karl Marx was a dramatically better communicator than most versions of God that have ever been proposed.
Amen.
No, I'm serious. I wrote in a post recently, we are now living in a time when it may actually be possible, thanks to the technology that we have now, that in 1,000 or 2,000 years, the blogs that we write will still be being read by people. They will still be online. That is a possibility now, I think. And if they are, I don't think there is going to be anybody who reads my blog and thinks that I was homophobic. This is not really the case for, among other people, the Christian God. You know, I see conservatives and fundamentalists, so-called, claiming that it's really very obvious that God thinks gay sex is horrible and that queer people should burn in hell. And I see LGBT believers and liberal Christians claiming that it's really very obvious that Jesus would have been on our side and that we are doing absolutely nothing wrong as far as the true Christianity. And no, I'm not really on board with that. Obviously, it's not obvious because queer Christianity has only really emerged as a political constituency in the last 50 to 100 years. And I find it rather superficial at best to suggest that God really wanted to send humanity a message about what he wanted for them, but he failed to communicate it at all effectively for the first 95% of the religion that he founded.
Yes.
That does not seem like the behavior of a god. I will say, I think that the concept of a true religion, or the true version of one religion, can be interpreted in two ways. We can talk about true Christianity or Islam or whatever in theological terms, which is what that discussion is doing. And I think that's what theology always has been, and that's what believers will do among themselves, and sometimes atheists will participate. And I think there's a place for that. Then we can talk about the concept of true religion in sociological or political terms, and there I think it falls apart. We can, supposing that we grant for the sake of argument that the Quran and the texts of Islam and the traditions of Islam are absolutely pro what ISIS does, supposing that we take that as axiomatic. It's simply not true that that is a version of Islam which, or rather it's true that that's a version of Islam that significant numbers of the world's Muslims don't. I think if we insist on imposing the idea of a true religion, when it's something that large numbers of that religion's followers don't practice, the discussion has become slightly meaningless. What does Islam even mean if there are millions of Muslims who don't practice it? What does Christianity even mean if there are millions of Christians who don't practice it? So
I think
that.
I think Kaveh has a really good point to the extent that if you are of the mindset that Islam is true, and the Quran is an authoritative text on what Islam really means. I mean, conditionally, if that's what you think, then it is easy to point out all sorts of really terrible passages in the Quran, just like there are a lot of terrible passages in the Bible, and say, look, this says some terrible stuff. You don't agree with that, do you? And that can be a good technique for shaking loose very true believers who want to believe that their book is infallible, and at least introduce some modern discomfort by pointing out the contradictions between this ancient book and the values that they may also have as a person living in the 21st century. And I think that it's really good and important to make people uncomfortable in that way.
Sure, I agree. And I think that's an important discussion as far as philosophy and theology, or atheology. I don't think it's as important when we're talking about the ways that religion plays out in the real world. We see things like the Charlie Hebdo shootings or 9/11 or whatever, and we see liberal Muslims saying this is not the true Islam. This is not what the religion scriptures say.
Right. And like Kaveh, I'm glad that they say that, but I'm not in agreement with them because I don't think, like I've been saying, that there is a true version that can really be nailed down all that well.
Sure, and I agree with that. And I think that has its place. But as far as talking about the political situation in the world and the way that religions actually play out, we will see atheists respond to that by saying that is not the true version of religion. And then we'll see Muslims doing things like starting charities and all of that. And atheists will go, hey, but that's not the true version of your religion. It doesn't seem very consistent. As far as discussions of, for example, religion as a harmful force in the world, I'm much more interested in the multitude of inconsistent ways that religions play out in reality than in the idea of attacking a kind of Platonic form of that religion, whether or not it corresponds with what people really think.
Yeah,
I'm sorry. I just want to say that one element that we shouldn't forget is the power of religion. If you go to a place where Marxism is really the dominant discourse, and you can find these spaces in Iran. Iranian intellectuals used to be completely communist, and sections of them exist. You will see that in these spaces, even the texts of Marx are treated the same way that we treat the texts of Quran, or Muslims treat them. So I think that one element, and this is, I agree with you, Alex. I'm not saying that we shouldn't encourage moderate religious people from doing what they do. As you know, I have half of my blog is dedicated to defending the reformists. The other half is dedicated to attacking them. So what I mean is that
I was against radical Islam before I was for it. Sorry, American joke.
What I want to say is that when I want religion to become a topic like every other religion, and sometimes I feel, maybe I'm mistaken and you will correct me, sometimes I feel when we talk about religion in this sense, as in, yes, let them do what they want to do, we are accepting that religion has a special status, that it can exist in this post-structuralist heaven that no other discourse can. So sometimes I want to, and I see that Dan is very disappointed in me right now. So.
Okay, did you have something to say, Dan?
Yeah, there's three contexts. The three, so Alex only mentioned two there. He mentioned theology, the internal coherence of the system. Okay, yeah, that is a way that, and I love Alex's piece about how theologically Jesus was not pro-gay, and I think that's valuable and important that we do that stuff and show them when they want to claim our theology is true, we can go to them and say, yeah, look at all these contradictions. Look at how it doesn't square with modern values you think it can. Yeah, break down, it's atheism all the way, theology is false. That's one context of discussion. Are they being internally consistent? Are they, do their texts really support the values they're trying to say it does? And on that grounds, I agree with you, Kaveh, there's no need to give religion an exemption from that kind of critical scrutiny. However, and there's also and I also agree with Alex, that it's vitally important that religions be held accountable for their actual sociological manifestations and not say, well, that has nothing to do with us. Just the way that Americans can't say, oh, slavery or racism has nothing to do with us. We have to own our past. And religions give a psychological barrier and a theological motive to doing that because they want to pretend their religion's so perfect that they won't own that, yes, our religion itself really caused these horrible things. So I'm with you in that anti-religious crusades, so to speak, on both of those issues. But the different jihad I also want to join is when you say we don't allow other areas of life to say, oh, we're going to change what we say. What we do when we're talking about true science, true medicine, true morality, and insofar as religion is a constructive, normative task, and some of people's utterances are about trying to fix their religion and square it, that is a place where it is legitimate to let them fix their religions. It's not, it's a different kind of argument we're having at that point. And I don't think that there's any law of the universe that says a religion can't transform into something different than it's ever been. So like Alex said earlier, well, if no one is actually living by that kind of Christianity now, how is it at all right for them to say this is the true one? But if what they do is by saying this is the true one, by making it that's the true one, it could be in 1,000 years, we could have 1,000 years of a gay, a pro-gay Christianity that would be, that at that point it would be funny to imagine there ever hadn't been one, right? In other words, it's something that can change normatively. And if we want to be constructive about religion, and not just try and take away this thing, we should support the way that it is logically trying to improve. Like when Russell asked about benchmarks, the benchmarks are not only an internal theological consistency issue. What the benchmarks are for the actual believer is, I believe these things about my faith. I also believe these benefits I want spiritually in these practices, And now I just need to also integrate what I'm learning about values and truth from outside the faith and find the way to find a new harmonious going forward point. And to me, that they do have goals. You can appeal to our shared values. You can appeal to what is ostensibly true and good that they recognize outside their religion, and say the true version of your religion will be the kind that no longer interferes with the true and the good. That will be the kind that accomplishes the true and the good in the best way possible, and that's more important than just a glass case theological consistency or a sociological accuracy to what it's been. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Go on.
I wanted to point out, you mentioned the benchmark again, and this idea. So, for example, both Judaism, if you look at the Talmud, for example, Judaism is not just the Torah, it's also Talmudic interpretation of the Torah, but also Jesus, when you look in the Gospels, they both say that the summary of the law and the prophets is to love your neighbor as yourself. Now, if you were to take that and say, okay, that is a statement of, that's the interpretive key for everything else, and you say, well, that's the goal, that's the ideal that's admirable, that makes me want to follow this religion. If you were to start with that, then you could say, well, that now allows me to reinterpret or alter everything else that I think disagrees with that. And so you could say that's the true religion, is that kernel of an ideal. Now, when Jesus originally, or when Jesus is depicted as saying that, he did not mean what we would mean by it today. He did not mean, oh, gays are okay and women should be equal to men. They weren't applying this consistently the way that we would today. But you could say that was an error of the past, and that the goal of the religion should be to realize that thing, and therefore that would give you allowance to alter the religion over time. And once you start realizing that the true application of that would be to change the religion. So you could even make a case that the most liberal forms, the most progressive forms of Christianity are the true forms of Christianity, once you start from the premise of what you mean by true form of Christianity. Whereas if you start from the true form, the idea of it being bibliolatry, the worship of the original text, even though there is no original text and we don't have it, but if you take it that way, then you get fundamentalism is the one true religion. But it all bases on what you start as the axiomatic premise for what you mean by true, which is an arbitrary choice. There actually is no universal reason why you should say that the text can't change, or that you have to interpret the text literally, or any of that. There's no objective reason why that is. That's just a decision people make. And I think it does relate to something Russell said earlier about how science, the benchmark for science is, well, is it true? And you can test it against reality. There's objective facts you can look at. The closest thing religions have to that is the scriptures. So you have the objective scriptures that everybody can look at, so you can argue over what they say. Or you can do what a lot of other Christians, including Paul, the founder of all modern Christianity, did, is just have a vision of Jesus. I mean, he didn't have the Gospels that he was reading. His information was coming by revelation. But the problem with that, which they realized very eventually, and why they created the Bible, the New Testament, to put a stop to this, was that if you allow revelation to be the true source of your understanding of the religion, now it's subjective. Now you can't verify things independently because, well, of course, we know as atheists that there is no God communicating with people. If he were, everybody would be getting the same revelations, and therefore revelation would be an objective source of truth. But since there is no God, no revelations are consistent, and so that's the problem. But once you're stuck in this worldview where you think God is really talking to people, the revelatory version of religion, rather than the scriptural version of religion, a religion based on how God inspires you to interpret the text or follow your religion, is just as true as the bibliolatric, the Bible worshipping, the scriptural worshipping version of the religion. There's no further level down where you can argue one is the correct way to define the true religion. And so I think that's a difficult perspective to work with when you're trying to pick one or the other and saying that's the only standard I'm going to use.
Can I say something? Excuse me.
Yes.
When Dan said that we should let religious people do, I promise you then that if I have the power to stop them, I won't. But I think that, and this is actually comes into play, because when we talk about things in an abstract fashion, it seems that we are controlling the discourse while we're not. One reason that I'm so adamant about this, and especially in context of Islam, is that from one hand, Islam does affect me in many ways. And I want to make sure that when the ultimate discourse about Islam is presented to the world, the loyal opposition side of the story is also heard. I'm not saying that, I'm not, again, I have never said that moderate people are like a shield for fundamentalists. I abhor such statements. Moderate religious people have been very courageous in what they have done. And as I've said, I have politically supported them. My atheism so far has not put my life in danger, but my support for Iranian reformists has. So I think that we can have two levels of debate. One, intellectual debate. When I come, I'm with you guys, but I'm not with you on this particular issue. So this is at least a disclosure of my motives when it comes to this debate. I'm sorry, Russell, for interrupting.
Well, actually, I did have a minor point to make, but I think it's more important that we get to the questions because we're running out of time.
Well, can I just say one last thing about the last two comments of Richard and Kaveh? When Richard said there was no objective way to do it, and in a certain sense that's true, because there's a number of different goals we could have. But let me make a case from a non-religious standpoint, what I think might be the best way to look at it, and that is that if we look at various human endeavors, government, medicine, science, we can ask of them what sort of goal do they accomplish that justify their existing at all, right? And then we can ask what the best government is, what the truest government is, as the one that accomplishes that task that justifies it being. And we could ask what the best morality is by what would it be that would justify us having a morality. And I guess what I would say is that from an external standpoint, I think there's a strong argument to make that we should encourage liberals who take the idea that when looking at religion, there's a best way to use this resource humanity has built, and that is what true religion would be. And in any given culture, with their particular symbolic attachments and rituals and identities, the liberals' mindset is, how do we make this institution that serves purposes actually serve humanity the best it can? And that would be the truest form in a normative sense. Does that make sense?
Yes, I'm going to have to go soon, so I just want to add that if we take that, which I think is a credible position to take, if you take that as the way to objectively define the true religion, notice that it does not get you to scripture worship. It does not get you to a literal reading of the scripture. In fact, it sends you in the other direction for what the true religion is. So in that sense, when you say the true religion, you're no longer talking about a literal interpretation of the text. And that's a point worth making. We do have some questions from the chat room.
Sorry, can I just say one thing before we go to Q&A?
Yeah, go ahead. Let me just say first, we might not be able to get to the questions in the chat room. Some of them are interesting, but highly technical, so we might not have time. I'm gonna have to bow out in like 4 minutes because I have to go for my next.
Why don't you let Richard answer the one question that was directed at him, and then you can.
What
Go ahead.
I mean the obscure thing that it's a thing about the transmission of the texts. I think I made the general point on that, and that's all that's necessary for the discussion. But let's let Alex weigh in on that, and then I'm gonna disappear soon. Go for it.
I apologize, by the way, my connection has been slightly
that's fine.
unreliable for the last few minutes. I think that when we essentialize religions and we talk about them as having fixed meanings, and by extension, when we talk about the idea that if you're a liberal religious believer or if you're an LGBT Christian, you're just getting it wrong and you need not to get it wrong. And when we simultaneously complain about dogmatism and fixed doctrine and insist on it, we're both being slightly hypocritical. But I think we're also missing a key point about this, which is that actually religions in some ways do inhabit a particular category, and supernatural belief systems generally, because they have an epistemology, as Russell said earlier, that doesn't require stringent verification. My problem with religions on the whole, and with religion as a core concept, is not that it's wedded to a fixed doctrine that can never change. It's the opposite. It's that religious beliefs can spiral wildly, unverifiably into every imaginable direction, and frequently directions that are horrible. And that's also true of liberal, superficially nice belief systems. There are manipulative, harmful behaviors that we see in very progressive versions of Christianity and other religions, which are simply the consequence of not having a very stringent epistemology. So when we talk about things like the question of religious homophobia, my objection to queer theology and queer Christianity in general is not that I think it's in some arbitrary way getting it wrong. I think that does not seem a very politically meaningful objection. My problem is that I think it's motivated reasoning. My problem is I think there is a religionizing agenda in the queer community happening that is itself harmful and is not actually as inclusive as it wants to be. So I'm not interested in, I will argue theology if other people insist on it, because I claim that right as an unbeliever. But I'm actually much more interested in the practical manifestations of true or non-true belief than I am in holding on to a Platonic version of what they supposedly mean and criticizing that at all cost.
Yeah,
that's
me. That's well said. Good point. Unfortunately, I have to bow out, so I'm going to leave it to you guys to continue. You can deal with questions in the chat room, or if you have other things you want to talk amongst each other, go right ahead. This has been great. So see you guys later. Bye, y'all.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Richard. Thanks.
Bye, Richard.
Maybe Brienne can answer, because I feel like traditionally these panels have ended a few minutes early anyway and not gone right up against the hour.
They have, yeah. We aren't getting any more questions from the chat room. Lots of comments, lots of discussions. So I think people really did appreciate the conversation that was going on here today. If you guys are ready to wrap up, we can end it so people have time to get some coffee and then get ready for the next panel.
Some questions about Hadith. They popped up. It seemed there was a debate going on in the chat room. I just want to say that if you follow Muslim clerics, and I do, you will see new hadith coming to life on a daily basis. And that is why I have never relied on hadith, because you can make things up as you go along. Hadith is a very open-ended thing. And I have focused on Quran because whether Quran changed historically or not, it doesn't change now. That's my answer to the question of hadith versus the Quran.
Although, as a frequent atheist debater, I'd like to say that the fact that hadith is just making stuff up as you go along does not make it substantially different from any other religious text. The other books were just made up longer ago.
Yes, that's true, and that's to go back to my first comment on Protestantism and biblical essentialism. That's why I sort of have some difficulty with the idea that if something is not in the Bible, like the Assumption of Mary, for example, if there's a particular Christian belief that isn't biblically based, then that's just wrong. I find it. I was saying, I think to Russell recently, there's this humor about Mormonism that I see a lot. Everybody laughs about the idea. No, of course Jesus didn't end up in North America. That's ridiculous. We all know he was born to a virgin in Bethlehem and he came back to Jerusalem. So it makes so much more sense. But the idea that God did reveal himself to Adam and Moses and Abraham and so on, and then eventually Paul and so on. Well, if he can reveal himself to all of those people, then why not to Aquinas? Why not to St. Francis? Why not to Joseph Smith? It doesn't seem particularly coherent to me to suggest that only one select religious book has a reliable telephone line to God and nobody else does. It seems really inconsistent and really arbitrary.
And I just want to say, when you said earlier that you feel like, okay, well, we're being hypocritical if we say don't take the text as fixed, and then we hammer them when they don't. I think if you just split the distinctions between the theological, the sociological, and the normative, then we can actually harmonize our three critiques. We can say kind of an argument are you making right now? And then answer that way.
No, I think that's right.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, yay, we end on peace and love.
Well, agreement anyway.
All right, close enough. I still hate you guys.
All right, thank you, gentlemen, for showing up and having this discussion with us, and thank you, everybody, for watching. Come back in about 5 minutes. We'll have our next panel up. You can go to our lanyard to see the full schedule for the rest of the day. We'll see you in about 5.
Look forward to it. Bye now.